In the summer of 1931, a silent killer was creeping across China. It wasn't an army, a disease, or a fire. It was water. Rivers swelled beyond their banks, swallowing villages whole. Cities vanished overnight. Millions of lives were shattered, and yet, the world barely noticed. And as the floodwaters rose, there was no warning, no escape. Only the relentless, unstoppable force of nature, sweeping everything in its path. By the time the waters receded, China would be forever changed, and the scale of the disaster would defy belief.
To understand the catastrophe that was about to engulf China, we must first look at the land, the people, and the weather leading up to 1931. That year, China faced one of the harshest winters in decades. Snow blanketed the northern provinces, freezing rivers and delaying the spring thaw. As winter ended, spring rains arrived, but they were unusually heavy, relentless, and widespread. In some regions, rainfall exceeded 150% of the average, saturating the soil and swelling rivers that already carried the snowmelt from the mountains. By early summer, the great rivers of China, the Yangtze, the Huai, and the Yellow River, were swollen to levels never recorded. These rivers, lifelines to millions of people, had a long history of flooding, but what was coming would dwarf anything ever seen. Officials and villagers alike could see the danger, yet the sheer scale of the approaching disaster was beyond imagination. The flood that would follow was colossal. By some estimates, water levels along the Yangtze rose more than 6 meters above normal. Entire provinces were submerged. The area affected stretched across hundreds of thousands of square kilometers, roughly the size of France. Some reports suggest that at the peak, nearly 50 million people were affected, with millions forced to flee for their lives. The causes of the flood were multiple. A combination of natural and human factors contributed to the devastation. Extreme weather, unusually heavy snowfall followed by relentless spring and summer rains, deforestation that weakened riverbanks, and outdated or poorly maintained levees and dikes. The rivers, once sources of life, became unstoppable forces of destruction. Villages that had existed for centuries were swept away overnight, leaving behind only memories and debris. The damages were staggering. Crops were destroyed, leading to famine in the months that followed. Homes, schools, and temples vanished beneath the waters. Entire towns were erased from the map. Disease spread rapidly through the displaced population, compounding the misery. Millions lost their lives, and countless others were left homeless, wandering through flooded plains, searching for food and shelter. The economic and social fabric of China was torn apart, and the disaster would take years, if not decades, to recover from. For those who survived the first waves of water, there was little time to rest. The floodwaters did not recede quickly. In some regions, water lingered for months. Communities were stranded on tiny patches of high ground, isolated and desperate. And yet, amid the despair, stories of courage, resilience, and survival began to emerge. Families working together to escape the rising waters, neighbors risking everything to save one another, and communities refusing to give in to the unstoppable force of nature. But for millions, the flood was merciless, leaving behind devastation on a scale almost unimaginable. By mid-July 1931, the Yangtze River had risen over 6 meters above its normal level, and the Huai and Yellow Rivers were nearing all-time records. Villages and towns along the riverbanks were the first to face the wrath of nature. In Anhui province alone, more than 1.2 million people were immediately at risk as levees gave way and floodwaters surged uncontrollably into homes and farmland. One survivor, Mr. Li from Anhui, recounted decades later, "The water came so fast, we barely had time to carry the children. Our house was gone in an hour. I held my youngest son above my head while my wife tried to keep the others afloat. I have never felt fear like that in my life." Others described seeing entire streets disappear in minutes, as if the earth itself had been swallowed by the river. The first wave of destruction was swift and merciless. Crops that had taken months to grow, rice, wheat, vegetables, were destroyed within days. In Jiangsu province, over 2 million hectares of farmland were submerged, leaving farmers with no harvest and no income. Livelihoods were wiped out overnight. Farmers, who had spent years cultivating their land, watched helplessly as water claimed everything they had. In Hunan, entire villages vanished under the murky floodwaters. Roads, bridges, and canals, the lifelines of these communities, were erased. Families clung to trees, rooftops, and makeshift rafts, paddling desperately through debris-filled waters. Some were carried miles downstream, separated from their families, surviving only by clinging to anything that floated. In one harrowing account, a mother survived 3 days on a broken roof with her 2 children, as the waters continued to rise around them. The first wave also triggered panic and mass migration. Millions fled toward higher ground, often traveling for days with little food or water. Refugee routes were chaotic, and many perished before reaching safety. Disease began spreading rapidly, even in the earliest days, as stagnant water mixed with sewage and human waste. Villagers who survived the initial surge faced the grim reality that safety was only temporary, and the flood was far from over. By the end of the first week, reports suggested that tens of thousands of people had drowned, while millions were stranded in isolated areas. The sheer speed and unpredictability of the flood made organized rescue nearly impossible. Communities improvised, forming human chains to save children, elderly, and livestock. But for every life saved, countless others were lost. Survivors spoke of a nightmarish soundscape, the roar of rivers, cracking levees, and the cries of those swept away. The first wave was only the beginning. It demonstrated the overwhelming power of the Yangtze, Huai, and Yellow rivers, and foreshadowed the even greater devastation to come. For millions of people, the flood was no longer a natural event. It was a force of destiny, reshaping lives, land, and the very fabric of society.
By late summer 1931, the floodwaters had reached their terrifying height. The Yangtze, Huai, and Yellow rivers had merged into a massive, unstoppable force, stretching across hundreds of thousands of square kilometers. Cities, towns, and villages that had stood for centuries were now islands in an endless sea of murky water. The flood was no longer a series of local disasters. It had become a national catastrophe. In the provinces of Anhui, Jiangsu, Henan, and Hubei, millions of people were stranded on rooftops, embankments, or tiny patches of high ground. Families scavenged for food, drinking stagnant water from the flood itself. Disease spread rapidly, with cholera, dysentery, typhoid, and malaria claiming thousands of lives. Starvation loomed as crops were washed away, and livestock drowned in the rising waters. Entire towns were left without shelter or supplies, their inhabitants clinging desperately to whatever they could find. The scale of the disaster was staggering. Estimates suggest that by the peak, nearly 50 million people were affected. Tens of thousands had drowned in the first weeks alone, and millions more faced the slow, creeping death of hunger and disease. The floodwaters didn't discriminate. Rich and poor, city and countryside, young and old. Everyone was at risk. Communication lines were destroyed, leaving officials powerless to coordinate relief. In some areas, bodies floated downstream for miles, a haunting reminder of the flood's merciless power. The rivers themselves had become agents of destruction. Entire levees collapsed under the pressure, turning once protected villages into watery graves. Bridges, roads, and railways vanished, isolating communities for weeks. Boats were the only lifeline, but there were never enough to rescue everyone. In desperate attempts to survive, people built makeshift rafts from doors, barrels, and anything that floated. Some families paddled for days, hoping to reach higher ground, while others were swept away by sudden surges or hidden currents. Amid this chaos, acts of heroism emerged. Villagers banded together to rescue neighbors, local officials risked their lives to guide refugees, and volunteers navigated the treacherous waters to deliver food and medicine. Yet even these stories of courage were dwarfed by the scale of the disaster. Entire provinces were underwater, millions were homeless, and there was no end in sight. The flood had turned China into a nation of survivors, where every day was a battle against hunger, disease, and despair. By the time the waters reached their maximum height, it is estimated that 6 million lives were lost, with millions more displaced. Crops were destroyed over tens of thousands of square kilometers, leading to famine that would linger for years. The flood didn't just destroy homes, it shattered the very fabric of society, leaving communities broken, families torn apart, and an entire nation grieving. And yet, even in the darkest moments, the resilience of the human spirit shone through, as survivors clung to hope in a world that had been transformed beyond recognition. As the waters of the 1931 floods slowly began to recede, a new horror revealed itself. Entire towns had vanished, their streets replaced by mud and debris. Fields that had once fed millions were submerged under silt and sand, leaving nothing but wastelands. Survivors emerged from rooftops, temporary rafts, or isolated patches of high ground, only to find that their homes, livelihoods, and neighbors had been swept away.
Famine quickly followed the floods. With crops destroyed across tens of thousands of square kilometers, food was scarce. Markets lay empty, and what little grain remained was often contaminated by floodwaters. Millions of people faced starvation, forced to scavenge for roots, wild vegetables, or whatever scraps they could find. Disease spread like wildfire in the makeshift refugee camps. Cholera, dysentery, typhoid, and malaria claimed countless lives, further compounding the human toll of the disaster. The economic impact was staggering. Roads, bridges, and railways had been destroyed, cutting off trade routes and isolating entire regions. Ports and warehouses were flooded, erasing years of stored grain and goods. Rebuilding would take years, yet many communities had lost the labor force needed to reconstruct homes and farms. For millions, there was no immediate help, only the struggle to survive in a world transformed by water. International aid was limited. Relief organizations and the Chinese government struggled to reach affected areas. Boats and temporary shelters were sent where possible, but the sheer scale of the disaster overwhelmed all efforts. In many regions, survivors relied on local communities, scavenging what they could and helping each other rebuild the shattered remnants of their villages. The social consequences were profound. Families had been split apart, some members lost forever to the flood or disease. Children were orphaned, and the elderly often had no one to care for them. The psychological scars were deep, as survivors faced the trauma of having witnessed death and destruction on an unimaginable scale. For many, life would never return to the way it had been before the flood. Yet, amid the devastation, stories of human resilience and solidarity emerged. Villagers banded together to dig canals, repair levees, and salvage farmland. Communities shared food and water, cared for the sick, and supported those who had lost everything. Slowly, the nation began the long process of recovery, learning from the disaster and implementing measures to prevent such catastrophic flooding in the future. Dikes were rebuilt, river management was improved, and awareness of the dangers of seasonal flooding became widespread. The 1931 China floods remain one of the deadliest natural disasters in recorded history. Estimates suggest that between 3 to 6 million people lost their lives, with tens of millions more affected. Entire provinces were devastated, and the scars of the flood lasted for decades. Yet, the story of the flood is not only one of destruction, but also of courage, resilience, and the enduring human spirit. A reminder of the power of nature and the strength required to survive in its wake. The 1931 China floods were not just a natural disaster. They were a defining moment in the nation's history. Rivers that had nurtured life for centuries became instruments of destruction, reshaping the land, the economy, and the lives of tens of millions. Entire cities and villages disappeared beneath the waters, and millions of people lost their lives, their homes, and everything they had worked for. The flood tested China's resilience in ways few other events could. Yet, amid the tragedy, the story of the flood is also a story of human courage and determination. Survivors banded together, rescuing neighbors, rebuilding communities, and refusing to let despair take hold. They faced starvation, disease, and unimaginable loss, yet persevered. In doing so, they left a legacy of resilience that would inspire generations to come. The disaster also taught the world invaluable lessons about the power of nature and the importance of preparation. River management, levee construction, and flood warning systems were reconsidered and improved. The 1931 floods remain a reminder that even the most advanced societies are vulnerable to the forces of the natural world, and that human ingenuity and cooperation are often the only shields against disaster. Today, when we look back at the summer of 1931, we see more than just statistics or flooded landscapes. We see the faces of those who lived through the catastrophe, families torn apart, communities destroyed, and lives forever changed. We see courage, sacrifice, and the unyielding human spirit confronting the unimaginable. And now we ask you, if a disaster like this were to strike today, would you be prepared? What would you do to survive, and how would your community come together in the face of overwhelming forces of nature? Please tell us your thoughts in the comments below. We would love to hear your answers.